Flyweight never die, and that was something that at Fight Night Picks we had to say all the time. 2018, 19, 20, because the division seemed to be on the way out. Now all of a sudden, it's popping. It's the hottest division in the game, or at least one of them. I mean, Figueiredo, Moreno, we're going to get a fourth iteration of that. But coming up this weekend, we have a guy who beat the other Figueiredo. We have Malcolm Gordon taking on Ukraine's Psycho Denis Bondar. And I absolutely love this fight because for Bondar, we were expecting his debut not once, not twice, 3 times sold last year. And yes, he was originally supposed to take on Malcolm Gordon back in November, but before that, he drew Victor Rodriguez. He fell out of that fight. He drew Ode Osborne. We had a full prediction video for that fight. We were super excited about it. But ultimately now, he gets to spend a year on the shelf, taking on Toronto Top Team's own Malcolm X Gordon. And for Malcolm Gordon, he has a very interesting background in MMA because you watch him fight, and when he blitzes forward, he has a lot of success with his striking. But some fights he does that, and some fights he decides to just kind of play on the back foot, pop a jab out there, and wrestle almost when he needs to. And he's a guy that used to train primarily, and I'm interested to see who he has in his corner for this fight because it used to normally be Adrenaline over in London, and Bazooka Joe Valtellini's trained there in the past. He's had Mark Hominick in his corner before. If I'm not mistaken, Hominick was actually in his corner in his last fight. Chris Horodecki used to be in his camp, so a lot of big names at Adrenaline. But when I look at it for Malcolm Gordon, it's an interesting road to the UFC because he was the TKO flyweight champ in Quebec. If you want to see a wild Malcolm Gordon fight that's not in the UFC, his fight before that against Yoni Sherbatov, who used to be on The Ultimate Fighter, has his own gym in the Montreal area, that was a wild fight. Like, Malcolm almost gets finished, then he rallies back, there's like a slam in that one, and he ends up getting the submission win. But in the UFC, losses to Amir Albazi, a loss to Sumaderji, and then the win over Francisco Figueiredo. It's been a mixed bag for Malcolm Gordon.
It really has been. And you bring up his wrestling. It's such a weird part of his game because it always feels like he goes to it only when he has to, and it always comes a little bit too late because this is the problem with Malcolm Gordon. And it's not really something he can fix in his game. He's just not the most durable guy in the world. Like, we've seen it happen a lot throughout his career. When he gets hit clean, he normally gets hurt as a result of it. And even look at the Figueiredo fight. Like, against Figueiredo, who fights a lot like his brother, but kind of like a store brand version, like takes some of the air out and then a lot more of that air out, and you get Francisco Figueiredo. And if this was like the women's flyweight division, then beating the champion's sibling is probably enough for you to get a title shot. But unfortunately for Malcolm Gordon, there's a lot of steps in between Francisco and Devison. This is my issue with Malcolm Gordon, though, especially in this matchup against Denis Bondar, who we'll get to here in a second. With Malcolm Gordon's game, other than his lunging forward kind of style with his blitzes, I worry about how he's going to find sustained success throughout this fight because with Bondar, he himself is a very aggressive striker, and he is unique because he isn't the best guy at fighting backwards, so you might think, okay, Gordon is going to have some success, but I think the power that Bondar is going to be able to meet Gordon with every single time they do kind of clash on the feet is going to be a lot for Gordon to deal with. And when you do bring up his wrestling and it's sort of coming in a step too late, let's say he does find himself on the back foot, or if he's the one reacting to the strikes or even the wrestling of Bondar, I think Gordon's going to have a really hard time defensively in this matchup because if he's thinking wrestling when they're striking, or if they're striking when Bondar decides to go wrestling, I just think Gordon's going to really struggle with Bondar's ability to switch it up.
This needs to be said right now. If you like Denis Bondar, if you're on Topology, if you're on Sherdog, if you're on the UFC's website, I don't actually know what his record is. We have it as 16-3. That's what they have on Topology. But Sherdog has it as 14-2. And on the UFC site, they have it as 12-1. And then if you go to the UFC's website, this is the biggest head scratcher out of Denis Bondar before we really break down his technique and what he brings into the cage. He started fighting professionally in 2015. He had an amateur career from 2017 to 2019, he was the Gamma champion over in Southeast Asia. It was like a sponsored event by One Championship. This is my question. How can you be a pro and also an amateur? It doesn't make any sense. So that is one head-scratching thing now. Those fights on Tapology, they don't count those fights as pro fights, but still, he has amateur fights after he started competing as a pro. But what I really did like about him, I mean, other than the fact that he shares a last name with the first Canadian female in space and the first neurologist that ever made it to space, you know, Roberta Bondar. When I look at it for Denis, he takes liberties in his striking because his ground game is so damn good. And he's one of those guys that once he gets you down to the mat, he might make some positional mistakes, but he is very much finish over position. He's submission over position. He's ground and pound over submission. When he decides that he wants to put away his opponent, it's knee on belly. It's whatever he can get to keep a guy down to just go for that finish. So it's one of those things that could really, really cost him against some high-level opponents. But when I look at Denis Bondar, and you want to go back and you want to see some of the fun fights that he's had, the one that he had before coming into the UFC, the fight against Kanan Jafardi, that's a decent one. But the one that I really like to go back and watch is the one against Q and Jock, where he gets himself into all sorts of compromising positions. Yes, he ends up with a win there. Yes, he ends up with yet another finish. But Denis Bondar, interesting fighter. But again, a little bit better in the striking, but I wonder how it comes out in the wash with the wrestling and the grappling.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that Jacques fight, because here's the thing about Bondar. I genuinely think he should win this fight in most areas, if we're being honest. But his record's a little bit padded, and the one time he did fight a guy who did have a good record on his own record, he was tested quite a bit before he was able to get that finish. That is a good point that you bring up, because with Bondar, the positives are very eye-catching, but there are some negatives, like you brought up. Some of his positional awareness on the mat is a little bit concerning. Like, he lets his arms get wrapped up a lot when he tries to posture up to get down any of his ground and pound, and he is good at posturing up with his ground and pound, but he does really like planting his opposite arm on the ground, and you see in some of his fights, it gets wrapped up, never to the point where a guy kind of like shifts their hips and goes for the armbar, but you can tell that, okay, like let's say Brandon Moreno's the one on his back in that situation. I know we're talking about a guy making his UFC debut, but still, he'd be able to figure that out just like that and snatch up an arm. It might not cost him against Malcolm Gordon, but those are some holes in guys' games that they get away with, and then the second they get into the rankings, they still have those bad habits in their games, and then it gets picked up on by superior fighters.
So it'll be interesting to see what we get out of this fight, because again, for Gordon, he picks up his first win against Francisco Figueiredo. That fight was about 6 months ago, and for Denis Bondar, his last time out was a year and 5 months ago, so a little bit of time on the shelf. Fights falling out last year. The odds on this fight, the average on best fight odds, Bondar minus 250 favorite. Malcolm Gordon coming in somewhere around a plus 190. If we look over on Tapology, votes are a surprise to us there. To you, Matt? I'll say over under 70% on the UFC newcomer. What would you say?
I think they'll be over.
You think they'll be over? Look at that. 862 total votes, 84% Bondar. You got 56% by submission for the 16% that are Malcolm Gordon, 71% by decision. And I think if Gordon's going to get a win in this one, again, you look at Bondar, whether it's 1 loss, 2 losses, or 3 losses, you go through and look, he has been submitted in the past. He also is going to be making the cut down to 125, which he definitely has throughout his career. Just should be noted, the last time that he fought was for the WWFC Bantamweight title. So I'm sure it won't be a big issue, but definitely keep it in the back of your mind. When I look at this fight, though, I think Denis Bondar should be able to get the win. Again, a little bit better in the striking, a little bit more creative. And yes, Malcolm Gordon working that at Toronto Top Team, working that with the guys over at Adrenaline. But I think once this hits the mat, as good as Malcolm Gordon is on the ground, I think Denis Bondar is just going to be a step ahead.
Yeah, I like Gordon offensively on the ground, but defensively he does leave a little bit to be desired. And if Bondar is able to posture up and start getting some of that ground and pound off, I don't know how Gordon's going to be able to respond to that. Because, again, Gordon can have some of those flashes on the feet with some of his strikes, but I don't know how he's going to be able to sustain output for 2, 3, 4 minutes. Just do enough to win rounds in this fight, so I do like Bondar.
Big time fight coming up this weekend. Both of us going with Ukraine's own Denis Bondar to get the win in his UFC debut. Let us know down below who you have. Do you have the Canadian Malcolm Gordon? Do you have Denis Bondar to get the win? We got some big time fights coming up this weekend, including another Canadian, Marc-Andre Barriault, taking on Chidi Bang Bang and Njokuani. And in the main event, Sean Strickland and Jack Hermansson going at it. You're not going to want to miss. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, as we always say. Let's get into it.